All right, all right. Thank you so much for joining in to the James Spearman Show. And today I've got another amazing guest with us. And today I'm in the hangar, and you'll hear a little bit of maintenance going on in the background. We got some sheet metal, some rivets being pounded. Hopefully, not too bad for you. But um, uh, today we have Eileen with us, and I am so excited. And so she has a decorated career as a Air Force colonel, flight test engineer, among many airframes, and a CFI, and she's building her own aircraft. Has many books out as well. If you know about me, I'm an Air Force pilot as well. I fly the KC-135, and so it's awesome to always connect with a fellow aviator and service member. So, Eileen, I want to open the floor to you to introduce yourself.
Well, thanks, James. Thanks for having me on. I'm Eileen Bjorkman, and as James mentioned, I am retired colonel from the Air Force. I live up in the Everett, Washington, Seattle area right now, and looking forward to the interview.
Awesome. Eileen, many of the people that I start with, including myself, right? So at some point in aviation, there it sparks, right? There's everyone can think back to this moment where it hit me, and me specifically. My dad took me to an air show, and I got to sit in a 172, but that was the moment it clicked. I was like, yeah, I'm hooked. And so I'm sure there's a moment for you. Eileen, what got you into aviation?
So I actually grew up around airplanes. My dad was an Air Force pilot. My mother was even a private pilot. She didn't really fly much after she started having kids. I grew up with airplanes because my dad, even being an Air Force pilot, he also always owned an airplane, and he was very, very into aviation. But for some reason, that didn't really rub off on me when I was a kid. Yeah, I don't know if it was because growing up in the '60s and '70s, there weren't really a lot of career options for women in aviation at that time. I'm not really sure exactly why I didn't pick up on aviation as a possible career. But after I graduated from college, I had a degree in computer science. I was working for a year as a programmer in the Seattle area, and I was just a little bored, and I thought, maybe I should think about joining the Air Force, a little adventure. I only thought about the Air Force just because my dad had been in the Air Force. And so I went and talked to the recruiter, and next thing I knew, I was filling out all this paperwork, how recruiters are. And then I got to officer training school, and my eyes weren't good enough to be a pilot. I knew that going in. But I got to officer training school, and somewhere when I was at OTS, I don't remember the exact moment that it happened, but somewhere when I was at OTS, I started to realize that if you're going to be in the Air Force, you probably should be flying. And I distinctly remember going and talking with one of the advisors there and saying, I'm not sure I want to be an engineer. They brought me in to be an engineer. I said, I'm not sure I want to be an engineer. Maybe I should be a navigator instead. And he said, well, you're going off to get some additional training to be, education to be an engineer. Why don't you do that first and then apply for navigator school? So that was my original plan. But then before I could execute that plan, I met somebody that told me about, hey, you can go to test pilot school as an engineer. You don't have to be a pilot, and you could fly in the back of, F4s. And I was like, oh, that sounds more fun than being a navigator, because at that time in 1980, women couldn't fly in combat airplanes. And so if I had gone to navigator school, I would have been flying like a tanker, like you. Nothing wrong with that. But I just thought it sounded more exciting to be a flight test engineer and get to fly in all different kinds of airplanes. And so that's kind of where it went. And at some point in there, I thought, I should get my private pilot's license, and everything just kind of built on that. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. What airframe did your dad fly?
He flew F-100s.
Wow. And then was he a career guy as well?
Yes. So yeah, he came in the early 50s, and then just hung around. He did 20 years and retired as lieutenant colonel. And that's actually how we wound up in the Seattle area. Is when he retired, the family moved out to the Seattle area.
Really neat. The F-100 is an awesome aircraft in history, and my grandfather, he flew in World War II, flew the B-25, and then went on to fly. He was a bomber guy, B-36s and B-52s, and kind of got out towards the 50s, 50s and 60s. But really, really neat.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's always fun to hear the history of people who've done all those things.
Yeah. So talk to me about the aircraft that you got to sit, because there's the F4 is just one of them, right? And what was the experience of getting to that specifically? The F4 is an iconic aircraft, and I'm a heavy guy at heart. I like being able to get up and get coffee. I like being able to go to the bathroom. I like flying to airports where we're going to stay in a hotel, But it is super cool. I like aerobatic flying as well. But what was it like being able to sit in the back seat of some of these aircraft?
It, I think especially the F4, because my dad had been in Vietnam. I grew up in that area. I had that era. I had that connection to that era of aircraft. Obviously, the F4 was becoming an aging fighter by the time I came in the Air Force, and I first got to fly in the back of one in 1985, summer of 1985, when I started going through test pilot school. And I had some flying experience at that point. I had become a flight test engineer and had flown in the back of C-141s and C-130s, obviously very different, more like the experience that you had. And I was super eager to get in the back seat of the F4. It was actually the first aircraft that I flew, first fighter aircraft that I flew in the back seat of at Edwards. And I just remember getting in it and just feeling like I don't know, you feel like you're in a little cocoon kind of, and it just seemed like a very solid airframe. And I just remember being in awe that I was sitting in the back of this airplane, not this specific aircraft that had flown in Vietnam, but airplanes like it had flown in Vietnam. And I just remember, the excitement of, getting that first takeoff, and the power of the engines, the noise, the vibration. It's such a different experience from flying in a large airplane. And I just remember feeling more connected to the airplane. I think that's one of the big differences when you're flying in a fighter, especially in a tandem airplane, tandem seating like that. You just feel you feel like you're wearing the airplane. It's much more of a connection, if you will.
And it 2-to-1 thrust ratio on
Oh,
that aircraft?
yeah, I can't remember now what the thrust ratio is, but it can't accelerate in a climb. So yeah, but it does. I mean, yeah, it accelerates pretty quickly. Even being an older airplane, I remember just the acceleration taking off on the runway is it's breathtaking. And the climb. I mean, the newer airplanes are even better. But at that time, it was just the performance was just very, very impressive. And going supersonic too. I mean, that's another thing. Although going supersonic isn't as big of an event as you might think it is. You just get a little bit of you get some variation in the altimeter, and that's about it. You look at the Mach meter and go, oh, look, I'm at Mach 1.1.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I was at Oshkosh, I think 2 years ago, and obviously it's awesome going to Oshkosh and Sun and Fun and seeing the demonstration aircraft. And the F-16s and F-15s rolling through there. Normally, they're on point. They're awesome, and they always do the high-speed flyby, and they're always in the sound barrier. You can see the cone building up around the aircraft.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered. I was like, what happens if one of them just go a little bit too fast, or a little bit,
Oh, it's happened.
Yeah, I was there. I was there that year, 2 years ago, I think it was, and it like blew down the whole front row of fans.
Yeah, yeah. I've never seen it happen on low to the ground like that, but I've definitely heard stories. I know at least one pilot who did it in an air show. He accidentally went supersonic. He said, "Yeah, the FAA guy wasn't very happy with me."
Yeah, I think this guy he ended up he was coming down, and he kind of realized maybe just a little bit too late, and he had speed brakes out trying to catch it, but the speed brakes actually are what caused him to break the sound barrier. Where
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
yeah, the flight surface lifting up caused it to click over, where he thought he would have saved it with the speed brakes, but that's what caused it. So, and then so how long did you stay in the Air Force for?
Oh, I was in almost 30 full years. So 30
Wow.
years. Yeah. I don't know. Things were changing when I came in. I mentioned about how I realized when I got to OTS that I you should probably be flying if you were in the Air Force, especially as an officer. That actually started to change while I was in there. I think there started to be more recognition. First of all, there were starting to be fewer pilots, because we were downsizing. We didn't have as many airplanes. A lot of the airplanes, and it wasn't just pilots, it was navigators. A lot of the positions that we had for crew members were starting to go away, as the aircraft, you stopped having flight engineers. Of course, I realized they're enlisted in the Air Force, but that whole crew dynamic started to change, and you just didn't have as many rated officers, going into the 90s as you did at one time in the Air Force. And so that really, I think, started opening the potential for other career fields more so than previously. It used to be if you were an engineer or a comm officer or intel officer or something like that, you could make colonel, but it was harder than if you were a pilot. And you're trying to make general is with if you weren't a rated officer was a lot more difficult. But that really started to change I would say in the 1990s time frame. And so I think that made it a little bit easier for me. That wasn't so much an issue of being a woman as it was just the career field that I was in. But I originally, when I came in the Air Force, my role model was my dad at that time. He did 20 years, he retired. That was kind of what I thought I would do. 20 years, you're done, go off and do something else. And, but then as I started getting more senior in rank, I was a squadron commander, and I started to realize that that I was on a career path. I was on a path that was going to possibly get me to colonel. I didn't think I was going to be a general. I wasn't too concerned about that. But at some point in there, I realized that I probably could be a colonel. And I also had worked with colonels a lot more at that point and decided that they had jobs that I actually wanted. That was the other thing. And so it just sort of naturally happened. If I hadn't been selected for colonel, I would have been perfectly happy to retire, at about 20 years and go do something else. But it just worked out for me.
Yeah, whenever I deploy, obviously we're working alongside of the active duty, and my peers are normally they're at that point where they're deciding, hey, I'm going to go airlines, or hey, I'm gonna try for a full career in the Air Force, and it's a big decision.
Yeah.
um, and you mentioned it right there, like it was a conscious decision where you decided, okay, I have a path, and I want. What else would you say is in that decision point? Because what at that time point, how many of your peers would you say wanted to stay in versus wanted to go do something else?
Boy, it's hard to say because a lot of my peers have actually dropped out with a lot of the downsizing. So we were a very large year group that came in. A lot of the upswing started actually around 1978. They started bringing in these very large groups of people. And of course, then when the wall came down, they had too many people. So a lot of my year group got kind of decimated. A lot of people did early retirements, like at the 15-year point, that sort of thing. And so those of us left standing, I think after all of that happened, I think we were the people that wanted to hang around. I think a lot of it is, a lot of it for me was, was I continuing to get challenging assignments? Was I doing things that I thought were, contributing to the Air Force? And, was those were the kinds of things that mattered to me. Some people, the family gets to be an issue at some point, especially around the 20-year point. A lot of people have kids in high school, and they reach that point where they go, I just don't want to move my family anymore. At some point, the family gets a vote. And, I once heard a recruiter say, we recruit single people, but we retain families. So the family really does start to become a factor. I don't want to say it's a problem. It starts to become a factor at some point in a lot of people's decisions. For me, that was, never an issue. But it just, for me, it was, like I said, it was just the wanting to be able to contribute. And if I had ever felt at any point that I wasn't really contributing anymore, that would have been a signal to me to, okay, now it's time to go do something else as well. Yeah. So for me, I will admit that towards as I was approaching that 30-year point, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Like I said, I think it was a lot of, like you were talking about the one stars, trying to figure out what they want to do. And I was kind of the same way. And I was just not, I didn't have any, some people have very definite plans. I was just sort of like, yeah, I don't really know. I was originally planning to take a year off. I thought because, as a colonel, you make enough in retirement. You're not rich, but you can at least, pay your bills. And so I thought maybe I'll take a year off and I'll go hike the Appalachian Trail or something like that. And then I'll figure out what I'm going to do. And that, and I figured I was probably going to do some kind of consulting, or, I was stationed at the Pentagon when I retired. So I figured I'd do some consulting or work for Beltway Bandit. But I was also open to the idea. I wanted to move back to the Seattle area. I was open to the idea of, just finding a job back in the Seattle area. Like I said, I wasn't really exactly sure what I wanted to do. And then an opening at the Pentagon came up for a senior civilian. And some of the folks I worked with encouraged me to apply for the job. And it wasn't really something I had planned to do. I did not plan to become a government civilian, Air Force civilian when I retired, but I got the job, and that's what I wound up doing. So I just sort of fell into it.
Yeah, that's awesome though. Talk to me about the years doing that.
So that was my first job, was at the Pentagon. As I mentioned, it was an advisory job with modeling and simulation, which I got into a lot later in my career. And then about 9 months later, a job at the Flight Test Center, it was still called the Flight Test Center at the time, but at Edwards, came open, a similar kind of job. And I thought, oh, I'd always wanted to get back to Edwards. So that was an opportunity to do that. So I threw my name in the hat. Again, didn't necessarily have any expectation of getting the job, but threw my name in the hat and got the job. And so I moved back to Edwards. Working again. It was more of an advisory job, and but I was back into flight testing again, which is very exciting for me. Got to go out on the flight line and sit in control rooms. And I mean, I wasn't hands on at that point, but got to visit and do things like that and talk to people and just, did that for a few years. And just really, really enjoyed it. But at some point in there, I kind of went, whatever happened to taking a year off? And so, so at some point in there, I decided, hey, I'm going to go take that year off and see what I really want to do. I did that. I moved back up to the Seattle area, and I started writing at that time too. That was also a time where I had some extra time on my hands, and I'd always wanted to get into writing. I did a lot of technical writing, but I'd never done any kind of like storytelling, which was more what I was interested in doing. And so I started doing a little writing, started out with some magazine articles, that sort of thing. And then when I took that year off, I did a little bit more, kind of getting my writing skills where they needed to be. I took some writing classes and stuff like that. And got a little bit more into that. And after about a year, I was like, okay, I probably should think about getting a real job again. And again, a job came open back in the Air Force that just was a good fit for me. So I threw my name in the hat. And my thinking at that time was, if I don't get this job, it was back at Wright-Patterson. My thinking was, if I don't get this job, then I'm going to definitely go do something else. But I threw my name in the hat. And again, I got selected. So it's like, okay, I'm off to, back in the Air Force again, this time as a full, not just an advisor, but a full senior executive position. And I did that for, kind of bounced around again. I moved as much as a civilian as I did in the military. Did that, went back to the Pentagon for a couple more years, and then wound up back out at Edwards to finish up my career. So I retired last year about this time.
Wow. I did not realize that.
Yeah.
That is it. Yeah, that is really interesting. And, we're kind of, I'm glazing over the fact that, you're at Edwards working with testing on aircraft, but how many aircraft did you get to see before the world, kind of, before they hit the scene?
I'm sorry, before they what?
Like aircraft that were being tested by the Air Force that had not been used in combat yet. Because I know there's different facets. I know they're portions of it, they're just testing new equipment on aircraft that are already in use. But some of it, I had one boom operator that's with us. He was out at Edwards, and he was able to I think he's got refueling time in front of the B-21 Raider
Oh, cool.
while he was
Yeah.
up there, and a lot of stuff like that. Um, how unique was that? Were you able to see equipment that before it was even employed?
Oh yeah. Now the only program that I actually worked on like that was the C-17. I was sitting in the control room when the aircraft had its first flight, taking off from Long Beach and flying up to Edwards. That was in 1991. But yes, I did see quite a few aircraft arrive. When I was there, the B-2 was probably the big one. Coming in that let's see, I think that was in 89. Seemed like there was something
Wow.
else that had its first flight in 89. I can't remember now what it was, but yeah, the B-2 was probably the big one, being able to see like the YF-22, the YF-23, and then of course later the F-22. Although I think by the time I got back to Edwards, the F-22 was already flying in combat. But F-35, yeah, I mean, I just got to see, F-15E. I was there during their when they were doing the development of that aircraft. So yeah, there was always something going on. That was the cool part about being at Edwards, is you always see these new airplanes. The KC-46 was there when I first got back, and I don't think it was fully. It definitely was not fully operational yet, at that time. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah, it
still.
was, yeah, and then you're always seeing new, like you mentioned. Like I worked on the Lantern program, really dating myself here. The Lantern program, which was originally developed on the F-16, but it was actually fielded first on the F-15E. But yeah, it's always fun though to be able to hear about aircraft or systems that I worked on, and that they're working in an operational environment. In fact, I remember when they were evacuating Afghanistan, and the C-17 was the workhorse of that, and I just remember thinking, wow, it's doing what we designed it to do. It's the perfect aircraft for that, and it did its job really well, and all the crews did a great job as well.
Well, a lot of people don't remember because right now everyone's kind of making fun of the KC-46 because of how many issues it's had over time. But really, the original plane that had all those issues was the C-17, and they
Yes.
got all worked out, and it's amazing now, right? Like it's an amazing aircraft.
Yes. So yeah, it like any program, it had its growing pains. That's not unusual, and but once you work them out, and I mean, because the original buy for that airplane, if I remember right, was I think 220 or something like that, and then they cut the buy. They were only going to get like half that many. I don't remember now exactly what it was, like 120 or something. But then once they started fielding them, and the Army was just like, we need more of these. I mean, it was really the Army that got more of those airplanes for the Air Force, because once they saw how good it was, they said, yeah, we need to get this back up to that original buy. And that's pretty much where they wound up.
Yeah, it's pretty unique right now, and uh, a lot of talks on comparing our known capabilities to, let's say, China. Really, right now it's China, China, China. That's our joke, right? Like every
Mhm.
talk is about China, and from a capability standpoint, the equipment that we know about compared to what they have on paper, it looks like they may have an advantage, but most people don't know that. I mean, the Air Force tends to be, or the United States military tends to be leaps and bounds ahead of ahead of its adversaries, and the equipment that you know about right now started at probably the 80s, like the
Oh, yeah.
F-22. And
Mhm.
so if you know about those, that means there's something else. That's what I guess that's what I tell myself, but I've got some decent data to back that up. That the United States military has things that are probably again leaps and bounds that we may not see until they're employed.
And it's not just the airframe itself either. It's the equipment that goes on the airframe. I mean, you look at something like I'm doing research on gunships right now for a book that I'm working on, and you look at an AC-130J now, and you compare that. It's still a C-130, but you compare that equipment that's on there to what you had, say, even 20 years ago. I mean, it is leaps and bounds ahead of where that was. So you really can't tell what's going on with an aircraft just by looking at the outside of it.
Yeah, and not to mention probably the space capabilities that have not mean, really are not public. Nobody really talks about it. I mean, I'm in the Air Force and I just get briefings, right? Like we don't talk about the Space Force or their capabilities, but there's probably there's a reason they made it its own branch.
Yes.
So the capabilities there and the airframes that we'll probably likely see come out of there. I know they have one specific airframe that they launch and they do testing with, but who knows?
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, well, awesome. So you've got several successful books, and I, one thing I've been working on in the future is actually a book on aircraft ownership and kind of an aircraft owner's 101 book. And what I've learned is it's a whole new a whole new job learning how to write a book, bring it and publish it and have it edited and all of that. And I've got ChatGPT and Google and YouTube helping me, and it's still kind of hard for me to go through that. Um, how, you said you took some writing classes, but that's just part of it. Walk me through the process of you set a goal to write a book, and then getting it to the finish line, getting it out.
Yeah, I writing a book was actually always a long time goal of mine. I don't have many goals in life, but I don't have a bucket list or anything. But that was something that I was always interested in doing. I kind of figured it would be a technical book, because I was more of a technical person, did a lot of technical writing, those kinds of articles. But when I when I was thinking about, okay, now it's time to finally start writing a book, I thought my dad at the time had he built an airplane. He designed. Let me back up. He designed an airplane when he was in college at Texas A&M. The Air Force sent him there to finish his aero engineering degree, and he designed an airplane for his senior project to set an aviation world record, a distance record, nonstop for an aircraft that weighs less than 500 kilograms. That's the category that he was shooting for, and so he decided he was going to build this airplane, and his original plan was to build it right away. He graduated, got his degree in 1960. He was going to build it right away, set the record, and be done with it. Well, life gets in the way, right? And he finally built the airplane and set the record in 2010 when he was 82 years old. And so it was kind of this, kind of this very long journey. And at some point, I don't know exactly what happened, but at some point I just said, and I had actually written an article for EAA, their Sport Aviation magazine. When he had the first flight, I wrote a short article for EAA Sport Aviation magazine about it. And I called it The Propeller Under the Bed, because that was a title my mom had come up with. She used to say, if he ever builds that airplane, I'm going to write a book called The Propeller Under the Bed, because there really was a propeller under their bed for many years that he was planning to use on this aircraft. He wound up not using it eventually, but anyway, my mother passed away before the first flight of the airplane, and so I called the article The Propeller Under the Bed. And so I kept thinking about, my dad's story might make a book, and I've got this title that my mom, gave me, and so it just sort of, kind of went from there. I started to realize after a while that maybe my dad's story by itself wasn't enough for a book, and so I started to weave in the history of home-built aircraft, and that sort of a thing, and so what really happened was I started, I did some reading about how you get published and everything, and I realized that I probably needed some street cred, if you will, and so that's why I started writing some articles. I was very lucky that I managed to get a few articles written or published in Air and Space magazine fairly early on. I got kind of lucky there, and then I was able to do a few other things, and 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 a lot of that was came about because like I said, I took these classes because even though I could write technically, I was like, how do you tell a story? So it's called creative nonfiction. And so I took some creative nonfiction classes. I got some books. There's a lot of books out there about writing, as you probably found out. And I just kind of started going from there. I just started writing, that was a lot of it, was just started writing. And then it was time to start, okay, can I find a publisher, or do I do self-published, or can I find a publisher? And so at first I tried a little bit to get an agent. And I kept hearing, oh, it's a great story, but we just don't think the market's big enough. So then I had the idea to go to small presses. And so one of the presses I pitched was the University of Washington. I was an alumni. I figured that would get me a point anyway, maybe an extra point to get my foot in the door. And they took the book, they accepted the book. And they were the ones that wanted it to be more of the home building, more like an equal treatment. At that point, I really had, it was mostly my dad and some home building. They wanted to make it more home building. And so I rewrote the proposal and they accepted it. And it just kind of went from there. And, and it wound up being, I had a great editor. I was really glad to have a really good editor for the first time. She really helped me shape the book and, get it, I think, to where it was a much better book than if I had just written it on my own. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. It takes like a team, honestly.
Yeah. And you got to be patient too. Yeah. It's not, it's not an overnight process. Even if you self-publish, it's not an overnight process if you want to do it right. Yeah.
How long did it take you start to finish to finish that book?
Yeah, so I would say from the time I actually started to really write it, that was 2013, to where I got to where it was actually published was 2017. So that was about 4 years. The actual writing in earnest was probably about 2 years. So. But some of that was because I had to go back and because originally I did do some writing where it was mostly just my dad, and I had a lot of that written. And then I had to, of course, go back and do additional research and writing to, kind of blend it all together. So, but my latest books, though, they've taken, a year and a half to 2 years, just with doing all the research, and the writing itself isn't that hard. It's doing all the research and as you're writing, you all of a sudden, I can't tell you how many times I've fallen down rabbit holes, where you're like, oh, this would be a really cool thing to write about. And then you spend, like 2 days, chasing down some obscure fact. And then in the end, you decide not to use it, so you wind up with a lot of things like that as well.
Yeah. So I initially set out the goal. I was like, oh, I could do this in 6 months. And found out that's not the case.
Yeah. I'd say most books, even if you're a subject matter expert and you've already got the research close by, you're probably looking at least a year. So it just takes time to put things together. And I also find, and you don't always have this luxury, but it's best if you can write something and put it down, ideally for 6 months. And then when you go back and look at it again, you're like, oh my gosh, I could rewrite this. And it just is being able to step away from something and then go back to it. Most of the time you don't have that luxury. I mean, some people will say you should write something, put it in a drawer and pull it out again in a year. But a lot of times in the publishing industry, you don't have that luxury. So.
Yeah. So talk to me about your first book, History of Homebuilt. I am, like I said, I'm a junkie, and this is what I do. And I'm an APIA. I love to work on airplanes, love to fly them. And one day I want to build my own aircraft as well. And there's so many awesome stories from Homebuilt. And one of them is right next to me. You can't see it in the frame, but the Cirrus aircraft, a lot of people don't realize that aircraft was started by the Clapmeyer brothers, and they sold kit planes for years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Built them in barns.
Yeah.
and then somehow managed to take that and turn it into the most successful single engine piston of the modern era anyways.
Yeah. It's funny. That's one of those things. Again, I was aware for a long time that home built aircraft were around. I'd flown in a couple. A lot of people I knew. That a lot of people in the test business are also into the home builds, and so I had flown in some. I knew lots of people who built. Of course, my dad was working on his own airplane. It's one of those things though. I didn't think it was for me. It's interesting. I had a degree in aero engineering. The second degree the Air Force gave me was in aero engineering, but I didn't really have a good sense of how airplanes are actually built. How you actually rivet and how you do all those kinds of things. And it wasn't until I went to Oshkosh in 1993 was the first time I ever went there. And I remember I used to think, oh, I would not want to fly an airplane that I built because I didn't even own a drill. I just was not into that kind of stuff. But when I was at Oshkosh, I started to realize that these aren't rocket scientists that are building these airplanes. It's not, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's also, there's skills that you can obtain. And EAA helps you to obtain those skills. And within about a year or so, I said, you know what? I want to build an airplane and I think I can do this. And so I actually started building a plans built design called One Design, aerobatic airplane. And it's got it has steel tubing, welding, it's got fabric, it's got sheet metal, it has pretty much everything. And so I started taking all these classes and learning how to do all this stuff. And anyway, long story short, with all the moving and everything, I made very little progress on the airplane. And at one point, I kind of looked at my pathetic pile of parts that I'd managed to build. And I said, what am I doing? I don't even want to build this aerobatic airplane anymore. I like my decathlon. And so at that point, I decided I was just going to build an RV-8. And so it's probably about halfway finished. I'm waiting for the fuselage kit to show up. And once that shows up later this year, hopefully I'll be able to get it up in the air probably next year sometime, maybe about this time next year.
That's incredible. It's so funny in aviation. Many of my customers, I mean, they have no background in aviation whatsoever, and let's say they're 40s and 50s, they decide, hey, I think I'm going to get my pilot's license, and then they get the bug, and then a few years later, they're like, I think I'm going to build an airplane. And it's like went 0 to 100. And it's just so unique, and my message is out there. It's never too late to start, for sure. Once you get that bug, it's just like it just consumes you.
Yeah. Well, and I think for a lot of people, it's just hard to get into aviation until they're that age too, because it is it is an expensive thing to get into. It's not a cheap hobby, and I mean it can be. I mean there are inexpensive ways to do it, but it's not cheap. It takes a lot of time, and so a lot of people when they've got kids at home and they just don't have the money and the time, and then they get a little older, and now they start to have more money and more time, and so it makes sense that it is a field that a lot of people do get into at a little bit later age.
So talk to me about what you learned when you were researching to write your Homebuilt book. The interesting stories that you uncovered, because I could probably talk to you for hours about, and until you go to Oshkosh and see, like, these are just people, and you can walk up to them and say hi. One of the ones, my favorite people to walk up to and see is, Mike and Mark Patey. They're kind of like big YouTubers now. They're real famous, but that it's kind of one of those things where you can just walk up and say, hey, I'm James, I'm a mechanic,
Yeah.
and have so much in common with. Talk to me about the research that you uncovered in writing that book.
Yeah, so I thought that EAA was kind of the start of home building, and I just had never really gone back and looked at what might have happened before then. And when I started doing my research, I quickly realized that home building actually started very early on in the United States. There were people offering plans to build airplanes not many years after the Wright brothers flew their first flight. And things really exploded after 1927 with Lindbergh's flight. I mean, aviation just took off in this country like you wouldn't believe. And of course, at that time, there was still a lot of war surplus aircraft, because we built a lot of airplanes for the war, but we got in so late, a lot of them never actually got used in the war. So there was a lot of surplus engines and aircraft still around, and a lot of people were, like I said, were very excited about flying. And of course, people didn't have a lot of money in those days either. And so there were all these magazines like Popular Aviation, which is Flying Magazine now. They published articles, that here's how to build an airplane. Here's the plans. And there was a guy named Ed Heath, and he was, he was very big in the home building industry back in those days. And unfortunately, he was killed in a plane crash. But his company later became and you may not remember this, but there was a company called Heath Kit that sold, kits for electronic equipment back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I think well into the 80s. I don't think they're in business anymore, but there was all this history, and there was a lot of states didn't like home built aircraft and they were outlawing them. And there was just all this kind of history. You had Oregon, which was kind of like this rebel state. I don't think it's a coincidence that Van's aircraft is located in Oregon, because they were the one state that still allowed home building just prior to World War II. And then after World War II, you had all these people that were flying, that had learned to fly in the World War II and that wanted to keep doing that kind of a thing. And home built aircraft was a way to keep that going. So it was just, it was just this very interesting history, all these connected pieces that you wouldn't necessarily have expected. And you certainly don't get if you just think that, home building started in 1953 when EAA started. There was this huge 50-year history that went on prior to that.
Yeah, I did not even know that the United States had a ban on home building prior to World War II. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And in states, yeah, it does make sense. I mean, many of the aircraft companies are based out of Oregon.
Yeah.
Today, and is that still from historically?
I think so. I mean, some of it is probably a little bit of coincidence, but I think just the fact that you had all these people that were part of that community and were able to remain part of that community, no matter what was going on with everything going on in the other states. I think that kind of gave Oregon a little bit of a leg up in that department. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess talent starts to attract or go where the airplanes are. And even at the time, right? Like you had Washington and Oregon. I mean, the Boeing company was right there, probably attracting a significant amount of talent just to that region. So I'm sure there's, anytime there's two pilots in a room, there's, difference of opinions. So like, I'm sure there's so many of people that work for Boeing that I'd like to dig into how many people that work for Boeing in the time that veered off and started their own aircraft company or kit company. That'd be interesting.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there's a lot. In fact, there was I'm pretty sure he worked for Boeing. Oh gosh, I can't remember his name right in a second. I should never do this on a podcast, right? But there was a guy that worked for Boeing, an engineer who did a lot of home built designs just on his own, just on the side. I mean, I think that's very common, that sort of a thing.
Yeah. One that comes to my mind, it's not Boeing, but it's the Piper Aerostar.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was branched off from one of their top engineers, decided to build the fastest twin engine piston aircraft ever exist. And then finally Piper kind of came back around and like, oh, okay, we'll let this in.
Yeah. Well, Pete Bowers, that was the name I was trying to think of. So yeah, he designed and built quite a few airplanes back in the day. So back in the 50s and 60s. Yeah.
Awesome. So so you're building this aircraft. How long have you been in the process so far?
Well, I originally bought the tail kit in 2014, and just because I was doing my government job still and everything, didn't really start working on it in earnest until last year, about this time last year, and then, like I said, I got the tail together, I got the wings together, and have bought the engine, got all this other stuff, and just really waiting for the fuselage. So yeah, it's a lot easier to do things in retirement, obviously. And I'm also working with some folks down in Oregon that they do what's called builder assistance. And so I'm still building the airplane, but I go down there, they've got mechanics to help. They know how to do things right the first time. I think that's probably the biggest thing, is when you're building an airplane. I discovered this with my one design. You spend an awful lot of time just looking at the plans going, now, how am I supposed to do that? Or you find out that you need some special tool to do something. And if you don't have that tool, something that would take 10 minutes with that tool now is going to take you, 40 hours, because you don't have that tool. So it's so working with these guys, like I said, they have the tools and the expertise and everything to help make sure that it gets done right the first time. That doesn't mean we haven't made some mistakes. It's a process, and there's still some mistakes. But the other thing is, when there is a mistake, they know how to fix it too. So it's been very educational and very helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, me as a mechanic, and my experience growing as a mechanic is always, can you find the answer? It's not necessarily do you have the answer, but can you find it? And so,
Yes, yeah.
there's somebody out there that has the answer, and you can do the research, try to figure it out yourself, or try to find someone that already has the answer for you.
Yeah, yeah.
Shorten that time significantly, or save you for messing it up the first time.
Right.
Yeah. So me, even in the industry, working every day, I mean, there's, I'm on the support line. If there's something that I've never seen before.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
yep. Have you thought about the avionics you're going to put in the aircraft?
Oh, I already have that too. Yeah, I had the panel built by somebody. So yeah, so
Oh,
I've already
okay.
got
Awesome.
that. It's a Garmin panel.
Did you do the G3X?
Yes. Yeah. Mhm.
Awesome. So yeah, that's a really good setup, and I'm a Garmin dealer. That's the only reason I ask it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's
I just started playing with it. That was one of the things at Oshkosh. I just went in their tent and started playing with it, and I was like, oh, this is pretty easy to use, and then it just seemed to make sense. So yeah.
Yeah. What do you do for navigators? Or is it going to be like a IFR setup, or just a VFR
No, it's
setup?
just VFR. Yeah, it's just
Okay.
VFR. Yeah,
You're
I'm
dealing with
building the airplane so it could be easily expanded to IFR. Because I'm not going to keep this airplane forever, obviously, and somebody could buy it and put IFR and autopilot and all that kind of stuff in if they wanted to. I tried to keep that in mind as I've been building.
Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah, yeah. It looks like you're breaking up a little there. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what about Navigator? Did you do GNC 375, like just the
Yeah,
small GPS that Garmin has? Okay.
yeah,
That's a
yeah.
good setup.
Yeah, it's a pretty basic panel. So I have a Super Decathlon, a 2003 Decathlon right now, and it's just got round dial instruments in it. I fly it VFR only. So yeah, I thought, what, I don't want to go back and try to get current on instruments again and everything. I'm pretty happy just bouncing around and doing aerobatics, so a few loops and rolls. That's really about all I want to do. So.
Yeah. Well, that GNC 375 is IFR approved, unit. So you
Yeah.
can't load in a localizer. You'd have to, you could go direct somewhere GPS and then shoot the RNAV. You gotta do it.
Yeah, if I really want to. So yeah.
If you need it, in a pinch. But
Yeah.
it's a good setup. That's one that I recommend somebody looking for a budget setup on like a 172 or an aircraft of that caliber, where they're not doing heavy cross country or heavy IFR flying. A G3X screen with a GNC 375 is like, it's perfect, because
Yeah.
most people aren't gonna. It's 2025. They're not gonna load up VOR to VOR anyways. They're
Right.
direct GPS.
Yeah. That's pretty much what I do with the GPS I have in my Decathlon. It's like direct. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a really neat setup. I think you'll enjoy it. Well, I really appreciate you on the show. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about, maybe some of the groups that you're a part of that have influenced you, and then maybe some things that are coming up for you in the future, in the near future for you.
So I'm sorry, you said what groups I'm part of?
Yeah. So just groups like AOPA, you've already mentioned the EAA a lot, which is a really awesome group that I'm a part of. And another one that's really important to me is the T34 Association. They've been a really awesome group and been very supportive to me. And I think I think I've joined the Women in Aviation as well, which is an amazing organization as well. And so I always try to give them a plug, because there's such a wealth of knowledge and support all these different organizations in aviation.
Yeah, so EAA is probably the biggest one that I that I work with. In terms of the programs, I'm a chapter president. I've been a member for over 30 years. I'm a lifetime member. But I also am a member of Women in Aviation International and Women Military Aviators. And we work pretty closely with WIA. We have a booth at their conference every year, which is coming up the end of March here in Denver this year. And Women Military Aviators is a group that was formed back in the around the 1982 timeframe. A lot of the early women aviators, felt like it was more of a social club kind of initially, but helping work various issues that women had in aviation, and they were very crucial in the push to get combat open to women. The law was changed in 1991. Finally, and then they continued to push for the policy to be changed as well, and it finally opened up combat aircraft to women in 1993. And so again, they're a great group. It's both. We have active duty members, we have retired members. We get together like at Oshkosh and at Women in Aviation International. All of those kinds of events, and then we have some of our own events as well. So. And then I'm also a member of the 99s. So, I don't do as much with them, but a lot of that's because right now the chapter in Seattle meets on the same day as my EAA chapter. So I can't be in two places at one time.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's such a wealth of knowledge and support in the aviation community, those groups. A lot of them do a lot of awesome work. I encourage you to join anyone that makes sense to you. They're all great, really.
Yeah. You really can't go wrong. So yeah.
Right. And then if somebody wanted to, again, thank you again for being on the show. If somebody wanted to purchase your books or learn more about you, what would be the easiest way for them to do that?
So my website is just my name, eileenbjorkman.com. I've got information on there about all my books. There's links to buy them. All my books are available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your favorite independent bookstore, and then my brain just shut down. So you might need to edit this part out. So yeah.
Oh, good. No, it's all good.
Yeah. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention was about my website is there are links to not all, but quite a few of the articles that I've published in magazines are available. So on that website as well.
Awesome. Well, Eileen, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you and your time. I really appreciate your service coming from another service member, and the work that you're doing in the community. I think is really awesome. And I hope to bump into you at some point in Oshkosh and Sun and Fun or any other air show that's out and about. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This is the James Spearman Show. Please be sure to like and subscribe and share it with your friends. These will be coming out weekly with other guests each week, someone that has a unique story in aviation because it is a lot of fun. So thank you for tuning in and happy flying.